When the story you've been told about yourself doesn't match the story you're telling yourself, the fear index spikes. Not because there's a clear threat, but because there's no clear truth. And the brain doesn't handle that well. It would rather have a bad answer than no answer at all. Hi everyone, I'm Lisa, and welcome back to Self-Awareness Sucks. Before we get into it, I just want to say I'm not a psychologist, a therapist, or a medical professional, and I'm not claiming to be, and I'm not here to give advice or a diagnosis. Everything I share on this podcast is based on my own experiences, thoughts, and observations, so please take what resonates, leave what doesn't, and if you are struggling with anything I mention, please do reach out to a qualified professional or at least someone you trust. One more thing before we start. This episode is going to touch on the idea of confronting things you might not be ready to face. And for some people, that could include quite heavy personal territory. So if that feels like too much today, please take care of yourself first. You can always come back if or when you're ready. Now, without realising it, I created a thread. Fear has been underneath every single episode of this season. Episode 1 was about the fear of never being able to switch off once self-awareness starts. Episode 2 was fear of conflict, managed through white lies. Episode 3 was the fear of being the one who has to do it, the paralysis that comes when you have all the ambition and all the plans and all the ideas and still can't make yourself start. Episode 4 was the fear of free will itself, which sounds strange until you sit with it and then it makes complete sense. Episode 5 was fear of being seen as cringe. And of course, episode 6 was the fear of being perceived, of the who does she think she is response. Episode 7 was fear made physical, felt in the body. Episode 8 was the fear of what you'll find if you actually look. Episode 9 was the partial dissolving of fear through language, the way naming something makes it slightly less terrifying. And episode 10 was fear of collapsing into self-censorship, into paralysis, into a version of yourself that's been edited down to something safe. So 10 episodes with fear underneath all of them. And that's what this episode is. Not another layer on top of everything we've already covered. It's the thing underneath all of it, finally looked at directly. And before I get into the theories, as I love them, I want to get physical. Not in that sense. Fear is an abstract. And I think we sometimes talk about it as if it is. And as I was going through what I wanted to cover in this episode, I realised that I personally have 3 distinct fear profiles that show up at different moments. And they don't actually all feel the same. The first one has a very specific signature. It starts at the back of my head, and it's this rush of sensation that moves down into my neck and through my shoulders, almost like a wave of warmth, but tighter and more like my muscles are all bracing at once. And then a rush of heat into my cheeks, but at the same time it feels like all of the colour is draining from my face. And then there's a lump in my throat and a very brief moment of breathlessness. Sometimes nausea, but then my heart races and sometimes my palms get sweaty and my hands start to shake. But the thing is, that physical response doesn't always arrive at the same time as the thing that caused it. When I'm dreading a message I haven't received yet, when I've said something to someone I'm interested in and I'm waiting to see how it's received, the fear builds the longer I sit with it. It's not so much a reaction to the moment, it's a reaction to my own thinking about the moment. And it's the overthinking generating the fear response just as effectively as the actual event would, which I think tells you something important about where the fear is really coming from. And then there's a second version, which is performance fear. Calls with strangers, rooms full of people I've never met, public speaking, maybe even a first date. Basically any situation where I'm the one being watched. My voice gets shaky, I stumble over my words, I hedge, I use fillers, I talk around the answer rather than giving one. And that version is about exposure, about being the person everyone is looking at with nowhere to hide. And the third version is the one that might surprise people when I describe it, because it might not look like fear from the outside. Now, I talked a little bit about how I communicate in moments of conflict, in difficult conversations, but there is another side to it. And it's that in conflict, I go very quiet. But on the inside, my brain is probably the busiest it ever gets. And what's happening in that moment of silence is this. I'm processing what the other person has said, trying to do the thing I talked about in earlier episodes, understanding where they're coming from, holding their perspective alongside mine, not shutting down or exploding. And at the same time, completely on autopilot and completely against my better judgment, I'm also thinking some genuinely quite harsh things. Reads on why someone might be behaving the way they are. Imagined versions of saying the quiet part out loud. Sentences I can picture delivering clearly and precisely that would cut right to the point. Maybe even things that are accurate to an extent, but things I would and will absolutely never say. Because once you say something, you can't take it back. You can try, you can apologise, and you can say, I didn't mean it, I take it back. But the words are in the air now, they've been said, they've made sound, and they've reached the other person and they're in their head now. And once something has been said, you're not just in the original conflict anymore. You're in a new one about why you said that, where it came from, what it means about you. And that's a whole separate conversation that I don't want to have, and my brain knows it. Which is why the rapid fire processing that leads to the quiet is also doing a very, very fast calculation of the domino effect of every possible response, every branch that this could lead to. And I think the reason that I don't say it goes back to a couple of phrases I learned and got installed in me very early, and I don't think I've ever let them go. Now, the first one we've probably all heard a million times, and it's, if you've got nothing nice to say, don't say anything at all. And when I first heard that, that was in primary school, during that period of bullying. And I think, of course, it stuck so hard because I was on the receiving end of people who hadn't seemed to have learned it from my perspective. And I wanted someone to apply it in my direction. And then the second one came from high school that our head teacher used to say, and it was, go round the roundabout. Think it through a few times before you choose your exit. Give yourself the full loop before you commit to a direction. And both of those are why the silence isn't a shutdown, and it's more like a held breath. The things I'm not saying aren't unsaid because I can't think of them. They're unsaid because I can think of them too clearly. And I know exactly what they'd cost if they ever left my mouth. And I think that's a really important distinction to make because it's different from what I talked about in episode 10. Self-censorship in that episode was fear-based editing. Holding something back because of what it might confirm about you, or because the imaginary audience was watching, or because the cost of being misread felt too high. Whereas this is something else. Choosing not to say the harsh thing in a conflict isn't about protecting my image or managing perception. It's more of a values-based edit rather than a fear-based one. And the difference, at least for me, is what's driving the silence. Fear asks, what will they think of me if I say this? Whereas values asks, what will this actually do? And is that what I want to do? And both can produce the same external result, going quiet, holding back, and choosing not to speak. But they come from completely different places. And self-awareness, at its most useful, is being able to tell which one is running in the moment. Because one is working through, the other one is just good judgment. And of course, in episode 7, I talked about how self-awareness lives in the body. And I think this is the same thing, just from a different angle. The body knows it's afraid before the mind has finished working out why. That physical signature, the wave down the neck, the lump in the throat, the shaky hands, that's your nervous system flagging something before your conscious mind has caught up. So yeah, for me, 3 profiles, same physical route. And underneath all of them, if I'm honest, is the same question running in the background. What is this response going to confirm or deny about me? And that's actually where I think all of this connects. The anticipatory dread, waiting for the message, isn't really actually about the message. It's about whether the message is going to confirm that I'm not desirable enough, or not interesting enough, or not worth keeping around. The performance fear isn't really about the strangers in the room. It's about whether their reaction is going to confirm that I'm too much, or not enough, or somehow wrong in a way that I can't fix. And the conflict silence isn't really about having nothing to say. It's about whether what I actually think would confirm something about me I'd then have to answer for. And this is the same fear that drove the white lies I talked all the way back in episode 2 about. Not lying for gain, but lying to preempt the discomfort of what an honest answer might confirm about me. And every flavour of fear is pointing at the same thing underneath. Not trusting that you are enough. Not believing that what you have to say has enough value to justify the risk of saying it. And that realisation is still settling for me, but I feel like it explains a lot. Now, this is going to sound really random, but behavioural finance has something called a fear index. And it's a measure of how much collective panic is driving market behaviour at any given moment, how volatile things are, and how much fear rather than logic is making the decisions. And I think we have our own internal version of that. Not a number, but a reading. And what it's actually measuring isn't the size of the threat in front of you, it's how stable your sense of self is underneath it. When that's solid, the fear index stays low, even in genuinely difficult situations. When it's shaky, the index spikes at almost nothing. And the threat doesn't have to be real for the panic to be. Which means the work isn't really about managing fear situation by situation. It's about building the kind of internal stability that keeps the index from spiking in the first place. And that, really, is what this entire season has been about so far. And this is actually where cognitive dissonance, something that I touched on in episode 9, comes back in. And just as a reminder, cognitive dissonance is the discomfort of holding two contradictory things at once. Two beliefs, two experiences, two versions of reality that don't add up. And fear, I think, is one of the most common responses to it. When the story you've been told about yourself doesn't match the story you're telling yourself, the fear index spikes. Not because there's a clear threat, but because there's no clear truth. And the brain doesn't handle that well. It would rather have a bad answer than no answer at all. Even if it is affect labeling, you gain control when you give it a name. And sometimes that bad name is all you need. That bad label is all you need to regain control and to stop the spike. So I think this is partly why when I was being told all those things in school, fat and ugly, whilst simultaneously being told the opposite of all of that by people at home, the negative version won more. Not because it was more credible, but because it was more specific, and it gave the fear somewhere concrete to point. And looking back through the frameworks from earlier in the season, both Goffman and Jung explain why. In Goffman's terms, I was being handed a front stage identity by the people bullying me, a performance of who they'd decided I was that had nothing to do with who I actually was backstage. The dissonance was between the role being imposed and the person underneath it. In Jung's terms, what was happening is something he called projected shadow. When someone hasn't dealt with their own darkness, their own insecurities, their own unresolved stuff, they sometimes project it outward onto someone else. And if you're young enough and the environment reinforces it consistently enough, you start absorbing that projected shadow as if it were your own. You start carrying something that was never yours to carry. And for me, that's what the bullying did. And the fear index has been spiking in response to it ever since. Now, before I get into more theory, I'm going to take it a little bit lighter, and I want to talk about where the actual day-to-day shift started for me, because it wasn't even a seminar or really a self-help book. It was something much more contemporary and of the times we're currently in, but they do amalgamate in a really nice way. So in 2023, I was really unhappy in the job I had at the time. Like, deeply unhappy in a way that I actually half ignored for a while. And I've talked about how, I think I've talked about how that period affected me physically, because I was so tired and I was so unmotivated by the job that I stopped moving and I wasn't eating very healthily, and then I went for that body scan, and that was that wake-up call that I needed. And I was so disconnected from my own body, and I didn't even realise it. But then at the same time, I was finishing my master's and commuting to the uni because I was doing it part-time and doing everything else that I do on the side. And somewhere during all of that, I started watching a YouTuber called My Fam, who has a brand called Alchemy. You might know it as the brand with what's been deemed as the hoodiest hoodie. And the particular videos I started watching was when she was 19 and she'd moved to New York completely alone. And she saw the apartment for the first time on the day she arrived. And she just got on with it. And it was an incredible apartment. She was so, so lucky. And it was just amazing how it all worked out. But she travelled by herself, made her own decisions, and built her own thing. And I found her, and I still find her, genuinely inspiring. Not in a motivational speaker way, but in a much more specific, vicarious way. I'd be watching her shop for home decor in her New York apartment whilst I was working in a job I hated and feeling very stuck. And so something in that contrast worked on me. It was aspirational in a way that didn't feel impossible. And she's 5 years younger than me, and at the time doing things I told myself weren't for someone like me yet. But she's so unashamedly herself in everything she puts out. And that really did something for me. And I think that you absorb more than you realise from the people you spend time watching and reading and listening to. And in particular, she talked a lot about James Clear's book, Atomic Habits. And I've mentioned her before, but she is the YouTuber that I've referenced. And so I'd been absorbing the ideas from the book through her before actually reading it myself, which I didn't do until 2025. But the core idea of his book is this. Small habits compound into identity, and identity drives lasting change. You don't set out to run a marathon. You become someone who runs. You don't decide to be a healthier person. You make one small decision repeatedly until it's just who you are. And the reason that reframing helped me so much is that I'd spent years trying to overhaul things in one go, going all in and burning out, which only reinforced the story that I wasn't someone who could sustain things. And so this book, Atomic Habits, gave me a different story. You're not failing because you're incapable. You're failing because you're going too hard, too fast, and then using the crash as evidence against yourself. So the advice to start smaller, to stay consistent, and let the identity follow, that was the switch I needed. And the same logic applies to fear. You don't have to stop being afraid all at once. You just have to do the next small thing anyway. And then there's a phrase on the back of the hoodies that Mai makes. And it's this. Your fear of looking stupid is holding you back. And I actually own that hoodie. Well, more than one in black, one in red. And that sentence has done more work on me than I've probably given it credit for. Because when you strip everything else away, that's what most of the fear I've been describing actually is. Not fear of genuine danger, just the fear of looking stupid. Fear of being seen trying and failing. Fear of being witnessed in the unpolished, uncertain, mid-attempt version of yourself. And having that sentence meant I could catch myself in the moment. When I feel the hesitation before doing something, before saying something, before putting something out into the world, I can ask, is this actual risk, or is this just fear of looking stupid? And more often than I'd like to admit, it's the second one. And interestingly enough, there's actually a second quote that I've had longer than having the hoodie. And it says, if you can't beat fear, just do it scared. And between those two sentences, there's most of what I've spent this episode trying to say. One names the problem, and the other is the answer. Not a complicated answer, just not a particularly comfortable one. But it's true. And there were other YouTubers who contributed to this shift as well. I've been watching two YouTubers who you might know very well called Dan and Phil since I was very young. And the way they show up now, completely unashamedly themselves, open and honest about their experiences and feelings, has given me a particular kind of permission. Not because I was trying to be like them, but because seeing people be fully themselves and be loved for it really does something to your sense of what's possible. So there's a new theory that I want to bring in because it explains something that both of those phrases about fear and acting through it, or in spite of it, point at but don't fully unpack. Why does the fear persist even when the actual threat is gone? Why does the imaginary audience still show up even when the room is empty? So, Michel Foucault, a French philosopher, historian, and many other things, in a book called Discipline and Punish, writes about a prison design called the panopticon. The cells are arranged in a circle around a central watchtower. Any prisoner could be watched at any moment, but crucially, they can never actually see whether the guard is there or not. So they start to assume they're always being watched. And eventually, they police themselves. So the watching doesn't need to happen for the behaviour to change. It's just that the possibility of watching is enough. And I think that's what I've been describing across this entire season. The imaginary audience from episode 6, the editing process from episode 10, the fear that shows up even when no one is actually there. And at some point, I think I internalised the watcher from the panopticon. The external judgment that used to come from other people got installed somewhere inside me and now runs automatically without anyone needing to be present. And I think this is the mechanism underneath episode 6 specifically. The problem with being perceived wasn't really about other people perceiving you. It was about having internalized their gaze so completely that you become the one doing the perceiving all the time from the inside. And so self-awareness in its most anxious form is being the guard and the prisoner at the same time. But I think this is the part that nobody warns you about. Knowing where the fear comes from or came from doesn't dissolve it. You can understand something completely and still feel it. The understanding and the feeling coexist, and sometimes the understanding makes it worse because now you can see it clearly and you still can't make it stop. You can have done years of work, named every pattern, traced every belief back to its root, and still the fear arrives right on schedule. And that gap between understanding something and being free of it is one of the most disorienting parts of self-awareness. Because the understanding can make you feel like you should be further along than you actually are. But feelings don't follow logic that cleanly. Sitting with that without using it as evidence that you're broken is its own specific skill. And that's one of the most specific ways self-awareness sucks, and I don't think it gets said enough. And something I want to name briefly because I mentioned it in the last episode. I talked about how I hate not knowing things and that I don't like being wrong, and I really don't like being proven wrong in an argument, and that there's a psychological concept for that tendency called the need for cognitive closure. And again, just as a reminder, it describes how some people have a stronger drive than others to reach a definite answer and to avoid ambiguity and to have things resolved rather than open. And people high in need for closure are more likely to stay quiet in situations where they might be wrong because the risk of being publicly corrected is too uncomfortable. Which is exactly what I was describing. Not fear of conflict for its own sake, but specifically the fear of being caught not knowing something, of the wrong answer being visible. And that's a different kind of fear to the others. And giving it a name means I can catch it more quickly when it shows up. But what does it actually look like to communicate through fear in real time when the fear is already there and the conversation is already happening? For me, it depends entirely on which of those profiles I described earlier has shown up. And this is where all of the previous episodes start to do practical work rather than just theoretical work. So when it's the anticipatory dread version, the waiting, the not knowing, the overthinking that generates its own fear response before anything has even happened, the language from episode 9 is what helps most. Naming it, saying it to myself. This is anticipatory dread. This is the panopticon running, and there is no guard in the watchtower right now. I'm generating this myself. Again, affect labeling. That idea from episode 8 that naming an emotion reduces its power works here in a really specific way. The moment I can say, I'm not actually afraid of the response, I'm afraid of what the response might confirm about me, the fear doesn't disappear, but it just gets a lot smaller and has a bit of an outline now. And as I talked about in episode 9, things with outlines are workable, and things without outlines are just static. So when it's the performance fear, with the shaky voice and the stumbling and the hedging and the inability to get my words out, what I've learned is that the hedging actually makes it worse. Every filler, every softener, it's just my opinion, but maybe, adds another layer of distance between me and what I'm actually trying to say. And the more distance there is, the more room there is for the other person to fill in the gap with something I didn't mean. And that's the self-censorship from episode 10 in its most practical form. The editing process that starts as self-protection ends up creating exactly the misunderstanding it was trying to prevent. So what actually helps is slowing down. Not speeding up to get through it faster, but slowing down, taking the pause I talked about in episode 8, and saying the true thing more simply and directly than feels comfortable. And it almost always feels like too much while you're doing it. But I think it almost always turns out to be exactly right. And when it's the conflict version, the held breath, the rapid fire internal processing, I've learned to watch for the moment when I notice I'm holding a queue of things I want to say and not saying any of them. That's the signal. Not to speak faster, but to slow down even further. And to ask myself, is what I'm about to say coming from values or from the part of me that just wants to win? Because those produce very different conversations. And the connecting thread across all three is this. Fear narrows your language. It makes you hedge when you should be direct, go silent when the silence isn't useful, and rush when you should slow down. But self-awareness doesn't stop that from happening. What it does give you is a slightly longer window between the fear arriving and the response leaving. And in that window, if you've done enough of this work, you can usually catch yourself and choose something closer to the truth. Not always, but maybe more often than before. And more often than before is the only honest measure of progress that you could possibly have at this point. And interestingly, there is a smaller version of this that I've seen everywhere. And I think it's worth pointing out because it's so common that it's become almost invisible. Now, over the years, I've learnt to watch what happens when someone receives a genuine compliment, including myself. Not just a throwaway one, but a real one. You know, someone says to you or says to the person, "Oh, you're so good at this. I couldn't have done it without you. You've absolutely smashed it." And the person immediately deflects, maybe saying, "Oh, I mean, it wasn't that big of a deal. The team did most of it, really. I've definitely done better." And I've been there. I've done that exact same thing. And I don't think that that's modesty. I think that that's fear. Fear of claiming the compliment, because claiming it means agreeing that you are that thing, and now you have to be that thing consistently, and now people are watching to see if you live up to it. And there's even a social script that reinforces it. There's that moment in Mean Girls, which is quoted enough, where Regina says, "You're really pretty." And Katie says, "Thank you." And immediately the response is, "Oh, so you agree, you think you're really pretty?" Now, obviously, this is a comedy. It's meant to be lighthearted, but it stuck with me, particularly as I was preparing for this episode, because it's almost as if accepting a compliment is the same as being arrogant. As if saying, "Yes, I'm good at this," is somehow more dangerous than saying I'm not. But then, on the other hand, claiming the things you're good at is its own specific kind of terrifying. Whether that's saying, "I'm a good singer, I'm a good writer, I'm a good friend, I'm genuinely excellent at spotting a minor celebrity in a TV show before anyone else in the room and can find them on IMDb and tell you every single TV show or movie they've ever been in." Anything, all of it. Staking a claim means potentially having to provide evidence. It means living up to something. It means the imaginary watcher in the watchtower has a new standard to hold you to. But here's what I've had to remind myself. You don't have to perform it on demand. You don't have to be consistent at it every single day to be allowed to claim it. And you don't have to monetize it either. You're allowed to be good at something without it becoming a responsibility or a proof point in a case someone's building against you. You're just allowed to be good at things. And in the same way, you're just allowed to be bad at things. That's it. And this connects directly back to this idea of how to be cringe is to be free, because being cringe is giving yourself freedom. Accepting a compliment without immediately shrinking it is its own specific version of that. Allowing yourself to be seen as the thing you actually are without apologising for it. But I also have to say that getting through fear is also just a lot of work. And I have to be honest about that rather than making it sound like a flick of a switch, because it isn't. Working through fear is exhausting, and being aware of it is even more exhausting. But it is possible. And for me, this meant pushing through embarrassment repeatedly and doing things that on the outside looked effortless, whilst on the inside my heart was hammering and my palms were sweating and I was just trying not to visibly panic. And that is tiring, because it would genuinely be easier in the short term to just stay small and not do these things. But I wanted to do these things because I felt like somewhere along the way I'd lost that part of myself. And I talked about it before, the dancing in the middle of the street, in stores or whatever, with people I feel comfortable with. I used to do that, and then I stopped doing it for a period of time. And so doing these things again was a way of me reclaiming part of myself. And honestly, yes, it did feel embarrassing and it did feel cringe. But I did it anyway because I wanted to get that part of myself back. So, yeah, That is the practical answer, and it's the one that's worked for me, but it is a lot less elegant than any theory. And it was pushing through the embarrassment. And when embarrassment shows up, or when fear shows up, or that voice telling you this is cringe and people are watching and you're going to regret this, what I've learned is to internally acknowledge it, almost make eye contact with it, and then just not give it the floor. It's a bit like that moment in a TV show when the side character is about to say something they shouldn't, and the main character just puts a hand over their mouth and steers them away. Or it's that little devil on your shoulder. You just flick it off and you keep going. And I think that laughing at yourself helps too. Not in a self-deprecating way, of course, and not in the way I talked about in episode 6 where you put yourself down before anyone else can. More like genuine lightness. Choosing not to take the moment too seriously, because the embarrassment, the cringe, the perceived awkwardness, it only grows if you keep feeding it attention. Whereas I think if you brush past it and it loses any momentum, it loses most of its power. If you fixate on it, it becomes the whole story, and it roots yourself in memory, and you'll get that horrible flashback on a random Tuesday when you're just trying to get through your day, and you get those full body shudders and you tense up and go, ew, 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 no, why did I do that? But I think if you just brush past it and laugh at it, you're less likely to have those moments. Now, I'm not going to lie, there are still moments that I think back on and I have to close my eyes and physically shake them off. But it happens less and less. And if I ever do get a moment where I'm like, oh my God, why did I do that? And I'm physically cringing, I try to laugh at them, because then it's kind of pushing against that cringe and it's changing the tone of it. And I think that makes it more digestible. And so interestingly, there's, I think, a reason why pushing through embarrassment repeatedly works better than avoiding it once. Because the fear response is partly a novelty response. The first time you do the scary thing, everything spikes. The second time, slightly less. The 10th time, your nervous system has started to update its threat assessment. And it's not that the thing becomes easy, it's that it becomes known and familiar. And known, as I said earlier, is at least survivable. You can't fear something the same way once you've survived it enough times to have data on it. And fear works the same way. If you allow it to steer you, to lead you by the collar, it will. And you'll never get to where you actually want to be. Not because you weren't capable, because you handed the directions to the wrong thing. And there is another thing that runs underneath all of this worth saying plainly. Fear, embarrassment, the imaginary audience, the deflected compliment. None of these things have power over you that you haven't given them. And that's not a criticism of anyone who struggled with any of it, including myself, because giving that power away often happens so gradually, you don't notice it once it's gone. But the same way it was given, it can be withdrawn. You can decide that this thing no longer gets to be the one steering. It doesn't have to have the final word just because it's had it for a long time. But here's something that I really want to touch on, because I think it's easily missed in a lot of self-improvement, growth, self-help, self-awareness, and all these things. And it's that stepping into the person you want to be is terrifying. Not in the abstract, but specifically practically terrifying. Because once you claim it, once you start actually doing the thing and being the version of yourself you've been sitting on, everything changes. And then you have to keep going. You can't unknow it. You can't undo it. You've stepped into something and now you're responsible to it. That's not a reason not to do it, but it is worth saying out loud, because I think that a lot of people get to that threshold and mistake the terror of commitment for a sign that they've made the wrong choice. They haven't. They've just arrived at the part nobody warned them about. And again, episode 4 comes back around. Free will is reason enough was about giving yourself permission to do the thing because you want to, without needing external justification. But wanting to and actually doing it are separated by exactly this: the terror of commitment, the fear of the journey, the weight of having to keep going once you've started. Free will gets you to the door, but getting through it is a different ask entirely. And there's something I've been sitting with, and I kind of want to name it as my own observation rather than actually something I've read or studied, because I don't think it's been named this way specifically. And I think that sometimes we fake fear. You've heard of fake it till you make it, pretending to be confident until you actually are. It stems from that. And it's not about performing confidence badly. It's actually performing the fear itself. I think that we use fear as a reason to stay still. Not because we're genuinely terrified of where we want to go, but because we're terrified of the bit in between. The journey. The uncertain, unplanned, uncontrolled stretch between who you are now and who you want to be. The destination is actually fine, it's just that the middle is unbearable. And faking fear is a rational response to that. If you're scared, you don't have to move. You don't have to step into the unknown. You don't have to face the uncertainty of not knowing how long it'll take, what it'll cost, whether the habits and the routines and the version of yourself you've built will survive the crossing. You get to stay where everything is known, and known is at least predictable, even if it's smaller than you want. And there's actually a specific type that I've seen talked about in psychology and self-development spaces that I think captures this really well. And I saw someone call it the paralyzed analyzer. The person who's incredibly smart, emotionally intelligent, great with people, highly motivated. They have the vision, the plan, the research, the spreadsheet, and they know exactly what they want and exactly what it would take to get there. But they never start. Not because they can't, but because they don't trust themselves enough to survive the uncertainty of the in-between. They don't have a stable enough internal sense of self to hand the reins over to the version of themselves that doesn't yet know how it all turns out. So they stay in the planning stage where everything is still possible and nothing has been tested yet and nothing has failed yet. And so they are still, in theory, capable of everything. And I think that's faking fear in its most sophisticated form. It looks like preparation, it looks like diligence, but underneath it's the same mechanism. The destination is fine, it is just this middle that's unbearable. And that is the shadow side of episode 3. No one is coming to do it for you is the realization that you have to move. Faking fear is the thing that stops you moving anyway, even after you've had that realization. And knowing and doing are still two completely different things. And this again connects to episode 8 because faking fear itself is a shadow behaviour. It's the comfortable excuse you've stopped questioning, kept in the dark, not because you don't know it's there, but because acknowledging it fully would mean having to do something about it. And in spirituality, there is a lot of talk about trusting the universe, allowing things to unfold, releasing the grip on outcomes, going with the flow. And if you're someone who likes to be organised and who likes to know what's coming, that is its own specific kind of terrifying. Surrendering control when control is the thing keeping you sane is not a small ask. But here's what faking fear actually costs. It keeps you in confirmation bias. It keeps you finding reasons to stay put, evidence that moving is dangerous, data points that prove the in-between isn't worth it. And the longer you stay, the more evidence accumulates, and the harder it becomes to distinguish the fear you're performing from the fear you actually feel. And the self-awareness piece is specifically this. You know you're doing it. That's what makes it a self-awareness sucks moment rather than just a fear moment. Someone who might not be as self-aware might just think that they're scared. Someone who has self-awareness watches themselves fake it, knows they're faking it, and has to sit with the discomfort of that knowing. The awareness doesn't automatically produce the change, it just removes the excuse of ignorance, which is, in a very precise way, the whole thesis of this season. It's a bit like knowing you take a shortcut every day that's actually longer than the route you've never tried, but you keep taking it anyway because at least you know where it goes. The self-awareness is knowing the shortcut is longer. The work is choosing to try the other road anyway, without knowing exactly where it leads or how long it takes to get there. So the question worth asking isn't, are you scared? It's, what specifically are you scared of? If the honest answer is the journey, not the destination, that's different information than if it's the arrival itself. And knowing which one it is changes what you do next. So there's something I want to say carefully here because it really matters. All of the fear I've described across this season, the white lies, the self-censorship, the careful management of how I come across, it wasn't irrational, it was learned. Real experiences, real people, real moments told me repeatedly that the unedited version wasn't safe. The fear was a reasonable response to that environment. Faking fear, staying small, deflecting compliments, all of it made sense given what I'd learned about what happened when I didn't. Self-awareness doesn't undo that learning automatically. And for some people, what self-awareness surfaces isn't just social anxiety or performance nerves. It might point towards something much heavier. Trauma isn't something you can think your way through, and I'm not suggesting it is at all. I think that self-awareness can bring things into the light that genuinely need more support than a podcast and a journal can give. So if something comes up for you in this process that feels too big to hold alone, please don't try to hold it alone. Talk to someone you trust or a professional if you can access one. There is no version of this work that requires you to go it alone. And the fear in this episode doesn't all feel the same, and it doesn't all require the same response. But one thing runs underneath all of it, at least in my experience. The fear is loudest when my sense of self is least stable. When I know who I am and trust it, the fear still shows up, but it doesn't have the same grip. When I'm uncertain, when I'm in the middle of something I haven't figured out yet, it can run the whole show. And so going back to that internal fear index, when your sense of self is solid, the index stays low. When it's shaky, the index spikes at almost nothing. And every single episode of this season, looked at from that angle, has been about one thing: building the kind of internal stability that keeps the index from spiking in the first place. And so with this podcast specifically, talking about these things out loud, episode by episode, has done something I didn't really anticipate. Every time I've recorded one of these episodes, I felt my own fear index drop slightly on the thing I was talking about. Not because the thing changed, because I kept saying it out loud until it stopped having the same grip. Each episode has been its own small act of doing it scared. And somewhere across 11 of them, I've become more comfortable, more confident, and even more myself than I was when I started. Which I think is the whole point. And also the most specific way self-awareness has been worth it so far. It's not finished, it's not even close, but it's moving. So this episode's Uncomfortably Honest is this. There's a specific flavour of fear I haven't talked about properly yet, and I'm not going to go into full detail today because I think it deserves its own space. It's the fear that lives in romantic situations specifically, in moments of wanting something from someone and not believing you deserve to get it. That one has its own story and its own route and its own very particular shape. What I will say is that it's the version where all the others collapse into one at the same time. The performance anxiety, the anticipatory dread, the terror of conflict, all of it simultaneously. And it has cost me in ways I'm still counting. So I'll come back to it when I'm ready. And here's what I want to leave you with. Fear is information. It's pointing at something. Usually something about what you believe you deserve or don't. Something about how safe you believe it is for the version of you that's trying to get out. And the question isn't how do you get rid of it? The question is, what is yours pointing at? And is that thing still true? Don't forget to follow or subscribe to make sure you catch future episodes. It really means a lot to me. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!